Hi, everybody. This is Father Nathan on the Joyful Friar podcast. It's good to have you here. Today is Good Friday. It takes all the nerve in the world for Christian people to commemorate the day when Jesus was crucified and call it good. But it's one of the things that I most appreciate about being a Christian and a Catholic, that we look for the good in everything. And we can look at the events of the day of Jesus's death, even though it was so horrific, it has so many elements to it, and still say, yes, but good is still working through this. I've lived my life that way. And when I have circumstances that just look to be awful, I move through it the way everybody else does. But I also know that I belong to this faith body that says, look for the good even here, because it's here. Well, I've been blessed to have this afterlife work that I've been doing for somewhere around 27 years now, where people died horrific deaths, but they bring me their stories in a dream. And we essentially say, and then what happened? Oftentimes we can think that death defines us, and a particularly tragic death of a loved one just can seem like such a colossal loss. The grief of losing someone suddenly and knowing that they endured a violent death can just be so all-consuming. But I believe, and my experiences have borne it out, that there's always a next chapter to the story. So today we're dealing with Buddy the Conductor. This is a little bit different in that if you're watching these podcasts in the sequence that we've made them available, it was 2 weeks ago that we had the story of Buddy who turned out to be the conductor. Then we had an Easter message, and now we're circling back to parts 2 and 3 of Buddy's story. We first tell the story, then in the second component we call compassionate response to that story, and then finally we have what we call spiritual practice that emerges from that story. So it could be that you want to go back and 2 podcasts ago and listen to that one where we retell Buddy's original story. I just listened to it this morning on Audible because I wanted to hear the whole thing with fresh ears and pray as I got ready to share these podcasts with you. And in fact, it was dear to me because my friend Laura Dunham, who died back in 2019, read the part of my sister Mimi. And so it's just lovely to hear the voice of a deceased loved one. I know some people will keep somebody's message machine on their phone or something and call just to hear the voice of the loved one. Anyway, it was fun to listen to Laura reading that part this morning. Well, compassionate response. Compassion means to suffer with. And when I do one of these, I'm particularly attuned to those of you who pay attention to these podcasts because you're suffering, because somebody you love has been through death, perhaps recently, and perhaps through a violent death. So I know that that's not everyone in this audience, but I have you especially in mind today. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize in Buddy's story, he was a young man at the time of his death. He was a passenger in a car. They'd been out drinking. The car was in a collision with a train that caused Buddy's death. He told us that he didn't so much choose a place in the afterlife as he just emerged or landed, if you will, found himself in this place where he and no one else was being punished, but it wasn't a pleasant place. He said it was a place sort of waiting, but they weren't waiting for anything in particular. Not like you might wait, in a line at the grocery store and you can watch the person ahead of you as their transaction is ending and know it's about time for your turn. It really wasn't like that. They were just waiting indefinitely and not sure what they were waiting for. All they had in common was they had died in the collisions of cars and trains. He said that they didn't talk about anything of importance, nothing that helped them advance. They were just sort of like he used the image of a bus stop, the way that you might chat up people idly just to pass the time, but that they had been stuck. And he used the word stuck and applied it to himself. He knew that he was stuck. He said that they were in a place where there was a train track running through the middle of it, a boulder on the tracks that was emblematic of being stuck. The train can't move. And that's where we met him. That's what he showed me in the initial dream that he brought. He also was quite determined right out of the gate. He told us that I'm not the conductor. These people want me to be the conductor. I never said I was the conductor. He didn't think of himself as a leader, and he didn't really see why he should be singled out to be taking the lead role in this, but he stepped up into it. He also told us, if you recall, that in terms of a career, that he didn't have one career exactly. He was good at figuring stuff out, kind of a jack of all trades. He was still young, so there might have been time for him to choose something more specific, but that didn't come to pass. His premature death ended that. Nevertheless, he was willing to step up and do this thing as long as he could do it on his own terms. He was adamant that he was not the conductor, but he stepped up anyway. He sized up the problem that, well, there's this railroad track and there's this boulder, but we can't move it. Well, that's when I came in and said, well, what might be a solution? Maybe a fulcrum, get everybody to lean against it. And he was the one that came up with the idea of heavy equipment. And oh, by the way, make sure that it has the keys in it. And when I got around to asking for it, I said, well, let's include an operator that knows how to run the thing, just in case it's more complicated than you might have thought. Well, all of that, we teamed up and got that to work. One of the things that I wanted to point out, especially to any of you who might be grieving the loss of a loved one, is the fact that he was angry. There's a way in which, when people think of spiritual things, anger might not be the first emotion that comes to mind. I've worked in and around churches for much of my life, and sometimes funerals or a medical trauma. Like I've met people in emergency rooms that are there with a loved one who's been through some medical emergency. Oftentimes those are car crashes and things, where I'm suddenly thrown together with people that don't spend much time in the presence of a priest. And, you know, they might feel ill at ease around me, or, you know, feel like they need to watch their language or somehow put on church manners right in the middle of what the crisis that they're going through. It reminded me of being on a jury one time. I was selected to be on a jury and had to hang out with, I was an alternate, so there were the 12 normal jurors and then 2 of us that were alternates. We hung around, the 14 of us, because we had to, and we were very different from one another, but we all belonged. You know, we're all registered voters, which is why we were in the jury selection pool to begin with. But there's a way in which we all radically belong. And sometimes church congregations can sort of self-segregate and have certain kinds of people that belong and others that don't. And sometimes the ones that don't know that they don't, and they'll say things like, oh, if I went to church, the roof would fall in, something like that. Well, Buddy was not, he never mentioned God or church or prayer or anything like that. He did tolerate it when I just said a simple prayer and said, God, would you please send us this heavy equipment? He tolerated that. But my point here is that there's not just one kind of person that moves through afterlife planes in my experience. Buddy was he was a little on the rude side toward me. He never did offer what his name is. He just said, just call me Buddy. And later he said he was messing with me. Well, that's okay. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't really disrespectful. He just was frustrated. Well, that's what I want to say. I believe there's room in the afterlife, from what I've seen, for all kinds of people. So if any of you are grieving the loss of someone who would have never been around a church or had kind of gruff manner or whatever, please don't assume that they're ill-suited to the afterlife necessarily. God's loving everybody all the time, and I believe somehow it all works out. I have one friend that even if we're talking about all kind of troubles, there'll come a point where she'll say, it's all good. Well, I believe that too. That circles back to Good Friday. It's all good. Well, he did tell us that at the time of his accidental death, that he and a friend had been out for a good time. They'd been drinking. He said he was not exactly sober. And that after the assault on his body, that he couldn't get back in it, that he was locked out of it. Well, that was frustrating to him. And I think frustration was one of the main emotions and thought patterns that he carried with him, frustration. Well, somehow or another, he did end up in my line. He didn't go into that. A lot of the other people do. He never mentioned a guardian angel. He never really mentioned a care team who had been working with him or prompting him in a certain direction. These conversations are like a lot of human interactions. They have their own flow to them. There's no one way that these conversations occur. And in this one, we just got in it and got started, and it really became solving a problem. He didn't offer a lot of background. He just said, we're all stuck here. We're all frustrated. There's this boulder. So we pretty much got to work on solving a problem. If you are grieving the life, the sudden death of someone, maybe like Buddy, I hope that you can just be at peace with the fact that God loves everybody all the time, and that your loved one, even if they were cantankerous or overly frightened about dying, or perhaps took their own life, or any of those kinds of things, I would just ask you, please don't make your grief harder than it has to be by presuming that somebody is, I don't know, ill-suited or unwelcome. I just don't think that's true. Everybody who God created, whether they believed in God or not, is eternal. Everybody survives their death, and there's a place for everyone. But he didn't choose that place, but there was a place for him. But he and the others knew that this was not a desirable permanent place. It was a stuck place, and that it would be best if they could move through it. He, in the follow-up interview, he referred to himself as being a jerk toward me because he didn't offer his name, which would have been polite. But the fact that you ask a question doesn't mean you demand its answer. When I asked him, what's your name? It was perfectly okay for him to say, just call me Buddy. I didn't deserve an answer other than that, and I wasn't offended at him not being more familiar. That's all right. He told us that in his short life, he used the metaphor of drifting. He said he wasn't a ball of fire, and then he talked about being in a stream, or like a kayak, or some sort of a boat that one would row. He said he didn't even always row his boat. He didn't steer his life. And then he thought, but once in a while, a canoe or a kayak will get sideways in the river, and you might have to steer it just a little bit so that it's straight in the flow again. He used that as a metaphor of how he had done a little bit of that with his life. I really admired the way that once he realized that he was in an active leadership role, yes, he said it wasn't something he'd volunteered for. I never said I was the conductor. He did assume responsibility, and he had resourcefulness and problem solving skills. He just looked like the kind of person that you might want to have around. I've done so much church work in my life, and especially in the Catholic Church, where all the clergy are male, it can seem very male dominated, but in fact, much of the work is done by women. I think much of the world is run by women, even in cultures or subcultures where their roles are secondary to those of men. In church life, sometimes you'll get men like Buddy who are really not gentlemen, if you will. They're coarse or rough, and they might not fit in polite church culture. But there's always ways that you can find a way for people to contribute, even if they're a little bit outside the norm. So there's been times in my career where I've seen that in a guy, and then so sometimes looked for physical work. Sometimes men that are not good at sharing their story or emotions, or maybe aren't that well educated. There's something that they can do with their hands. They can fix something or create something. And so a lot of times I've tried to size things up and see if I can find a way for guys to contribute. And it's even better if they can do that with another person so that it's not just in isolation. He struck me as such a guy, and landed in a place where people weren't cooperating with each other very well. They were all sort of doing their own thing, or not even doing very much at all, really. But he did show up. And even though he was reluctant, he did lead. If you're grieving anybody who had a hard time with other people, um, had a hard time making friends, if you're grieving anybody that was kind of mentally stuck in addiction or something like that, maybe Buddy's story can encourage you. People don't have to bound into the afterlife full of excitement about having just been killed in a collision of a car and a train. There's a place where they can just chill if that's what they need to do. In the podcast that will follow this one, I'll give some more advice on spiritual practices that might come into play, where you might be able to help someone like Buddy. But I think this whole business of all the stuff that I've seen in the afterlife is really about coming to the truth of ourselves. That all the different stories that my prayer partners and I have been brought into, a thing they have in common is that people are growing in truth, often truth about their own story and about their own personhood. That was one of the most gratifying things about the Buddy story as I look back on it now after a period of years. Buddy didn't think of himself as leadership material, and yet that's exactly what he turned out to be. So he learned a truth about himself that I think will serve him well in his eternal future, because now he has this experience he can look back on. The next time that leadership is called that he might be able to exercise, he won't necessarily say, oh, I'm not the conductor, it couldn't possibly be me. He might still have that thought, but he could at least go, but there was that one time. I remember that time when I thought I was not the conductor, but they asked me to be, and everything unfolded the way it needed to. It's all good. Well, that's my message today for Buddy, compassionate response. Just know that if you are suffering the loss of a loved one, you're in my prayers frequently. This ministry of mine it's kept me in touch with the sufferings of people who have lost a loved one suddenly. And you're not ever far from my thoughts and my heart. So I wish you well. And if you would like, stay tuned for the next episode of The Joyful Friar, which will be buddy and spiritual practices that might flow from his story that you might find helpful. But for now, God bless you. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can make a donation by clicking the donate button. See you next time.